If everything is framed as either or instead of yes and your viewpoint is more complex than that, you have nowhere to sit to engage in the conversation. It's not that we don't have something to say, it's that the current framework really limits our ability to be effective. How can the middle majority of Tennesseans hold lawmakers accountable? I thought the problem was that lawmakers didn't hear the middle. It was that they didn't fear the middle. I realized we don't have an amplification problem, we have an accountability problem. And that is what ultimately got us to the best of Tennessee and a focus on the primary elections as opposed to the general.
But what I hear you saying is, no, the middle is best understood as people that are not so rigid, that are more fluid, that are more open-minded. Am I putting words in your mouth?
I feel like this group has sort of left the building, as it were, of politics because everyone around them, it feels as though they're so right or wrong. And I think that injection of complexity is like the critical ingredient to a more functional democracy.
Welcome, everybody. I know it's the dog days of August, and appreciate everyone taking an hour out of your day to participate in this conversation, which I'm really excited about. Our guest today, as Russ said, is Chloe Akers. Chloe is a fifth generation Tennessean. She's an attorney. And in 2023, she launched the Liminal Plan, which morphed into the Best of Tennessee, which is an organization dedicated to shifting Tennessee's political culture by mobilizing more people to vote in the primaries, by increasing competition, and restoring complexity and diversity to our political discourse and policymaking. So welcome, Chloe. Great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. And hello to my friend in Tennessee, where it's very hot.
Yeah. Hey, before we dive in, and I have a million questions, Chloe, I actually just want to show a short 2-minute video clip of a recent news interview that you did that I think really captures well a lot of what you're looking to accomplish here. And I thought people would appreciate it. So Russ, can you run the clip?
We see this disconnect and an incredibly low voter turnout. And I think the folks that aren't turning out tend to be the middle because no one's really able to speak to them because the framework of politics is so all or nothing. There's not very much room for anyone who has a more complex view of the way in which things should happen.
Why are the people in the middle so quiet? Is it because they don't have anything to say? Is it because just a general lack of interest in politics, they've tuned out?
Oh, I don't think it's because they have nothing to say. I think it's that it feels exhausting to try to engage in a conversation where you have no seat at the table. If everything is framed as either or instead of yes and your viewpoint is more complex than that, you have nowhere to sit to engage in the conversation. It's not that we don't have something to say, it's that the current framework really limits our ability to be effective.
Is the feeling that politics has become so personal that it's hard to have those conversations because if you have relationships, you might put those relationships in danger or in them if you don't feel like there's a yes and situation on there. If it's an either or, then they'll just be quiet.
Oh, of course. And I think there's this feeling of righteousness on both sides that I am, one side is either totally right or the other side is totally wrong, and everyone is so dug in that it just isn't conducive to conversations that are civil and productive.
They're not low information voters. They don't stay quiet because they don't follow politics at all.
Oh, absolutely not. This is an incredibly intelligent, active group of Tennesseans that, again, have complex, complicated views, as most of us do, on any number of things.
If you manage to make this happen in Tennessee, this sounds like something you got to take nationwide because this seems to be a problem, I would guess, in all 50 states.
Oh, absolutely, Patton. And what an amazing opportunity for Tennesseans to lead the nation in showing what we can accomplish by activating our middle majority. I think we are particularly well suited in this state for this project, and I would welcome the opportunity to lead this and show the nation what we really are all about in this state.
I love that clip. In fact, I want to come back to the difference between yes and versus either or. I think that is like a profound difference that we need to unpackage a little bit. But before we do that, Chloe, introduce yourself. Who are you, and what are you all about?
Okay, I'll try to keep this brief. So, as John mentioned, my name is Chloe Akers. I'm a fifth generation East Tennessean. So I come from the side of the state that tends to be the most conservative. I live in Nashville now. I went to college at Cornell University, and then I came home for law school at UT. My life's goal was to be a death penalty lawyer. So after law school, I was a state and federal public defender all over the country. I worked in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I worked in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Seattle, Washington, and then back home in Knoxville. I was a public defender at the state and federal level for 11 years. And then I was in private practice for 3 years after that. Happy as a clam, loved being a trial lawyer. I joke all the time that I never thought I'd be in politics because generally when you take your first criminal case, you self-select right out of this industry. And as it turned out, I made an Instagram video on the day the Dobbs decision was decided, and it changed my life. So that's a little bit about my background and how I got here.
Yeah. So tell me, my understanding is you made this video right after the Supreme Court decision, and it was highlighting the way that that they enacted this trigger ban law in Tennessee, and you formed a project called the Liminal Plan to clarify that law. And then that was in early 2023. By mid 2023, you were talking about the need to hold elected officials accountable on a wide range of issues. And by the end of the summer in 2023, you're like, no, we need systemic change. This whole democracy has been undermined. So is that an accurate description of your journey? Can tell it in your own words.
Okay, so the first thing that I like to tell people is that in a million years, I never thought I would have anything to say about Instagram, content creation, influencers. Y'all,
Right.
here's what happened. On Friday, June 24th, 2022, like almost every other day, I was sitting in misdemeanor court waiting for a case to get called. I was on my phone when I got the New York Times notification that Dobbs had been released. I went back to my office and I read the opinion. And the first things to know about me that also just is the basis of our organization is I think like a lawyer. I think functionally, I don't think ideologically. My clients could give a hoot what my ideological viewpoint is on a law. They cared whether or not I was capable of functionally navigating that law. So after 14 years, it's just how you think. So I read the Dobbs decision, and then I immediately realized that Tennessee was about to have a new criminal law that was going to go into effect, and it was referred to as a trigger ban. And everywhere I was looking in the media, I was trying to understand, what does the law actually say, right? Because it's a criminal law. I'm a criminal lawyer. I had never read it. Nobody in my field, like in our field, had ever gone to the abortion section of the criminal code in 50 years. We just didn't have to. So I thought, well, I should read the law. So I read the Tennessee law on abortion. And again, not speaking ideologically, but speaking purely functionally from a criminal defense practice perspective, the law was a nightmare. It was going to be really difficult to enforce to any degree of sort of fairness. And it also was likely going to have really huge impacts on our doctors and our ability to recruit them to Tennessee, keep them in Tennessee, women with complex pregnancies. And I understood all of this because I understood how the law was written and the breadth and scope. And I quickly realized that we had no exceptions. We only had an affirmative defense, which if you practice criminal law, you know instantly is a really big deal. Okay. And so I had this feeling and I was like, okay, I think if I just make an Instagram video and I can explain to people how this might function, we could have a more meaningful conversation than devolving into like a discussion about when life began. I had 70 followers. I had a private Instagram account. Nobody likes you when you're a criminal defense lawyer. I thought maybe my mom would see this video. She did. A couple friends saw it. They said it was helpful for them to understand the concept. So I opened up my profile at their request and 2.3 million people saw it. Wow. So it was a 14-minute video that all these people watched that was just me chewing gum, my biggest regret, and explaining like this is how it's gonna work. And what happened from that is over the next 6 or 7 months, I was encountering people in Tennessee. I was doing all this public speaking and all these people would come up to me and say the same thing. Baby,
I am a Republican or I am a conservative East Tennessean, but this law does not reflect my views. Okay, this was over and over and over. The law wasn't reflecting the views of anybody I was encountering. And then the Vandy polling comes out in 2020, Vanderbilt polling comes out in 2022, which substantiates this in numbers. There's like, just as it is in the national political world, there is significant support in Tennessee, actionable consensus, bipartisan support for a law far less extreme than the one we had.
Got it.
So this is what got me to the liminal plan. I thought, oh, at first I thought this was a question of amplification. I later learned this was about accountability. I thought, well, if we just create an organization that can mobilize this middle majority on this one issue, surely we can bring the law in line with what the middle wants. And we need that because abortion itself was framed as either or. It was either murder or a human right. Well, if it's murder or a human right, there is no middle. And if you can't have a middle, then you can't engage the middle. So I just thought we would create an organization that could speak to the people in the middle and utilize that to mobilize the group to repair a law and bring it more in line with the majority. Throughout the 2020 year of our Lord 2023, which is what I call it in Tennessee politics, I realized that it wasn't, I thought the problem was that lawmakers didn't hear the middle. It was that they didn't fear the middle. And I don't mean like violence, I mean like accountability. I was like, oh, we just need to make sure they hear us. And then after about 6 months, kind of punctuated with the Covenant shooting, and then the special session on gun safety in Tennessee, I realized we don't have an amplification problem, we have an accountability problem. How can the middle majority of Tennesseans hold lawmakers accountable? And that is what ultimately got us to the best of Tennessee and a focus on the primary elections as opposed to the general.
Got it. So tell us about Best of Tennessee. You briefed me, but brief everybody on what your battle plan is and what you're looking to address.
Okay, so I'm plodding along this whole year, thinking it's an amplification issue when really it's an accountability issue. I joined forces with folks with Republicans, with independents, with other Democrats, and we sat down and I said, look, it's kind of like Fight Club. Like the first rule of Fight Club is don't talk about Fight Club. The first rule of policy is don't talk about policy, right? We can't have, it's not a policy-based organization. Effectively, what we realized is there is a problem in Tennessee with accountability, and here's how we think you solve it. The general elections in Tennessee are largely uncompetitive. This is not a feeling, this is not a sentiment, this is data-driven. Over the last 10 years, the composition of the House of Representatives and the state legislature has changed by 2 seats. The Senate has changed by 1. This includes the year 2020, where Tennessee had a record voter turnout in our general. 69% of Tennesseans cast a ballot. No seats in the House flipped. 1 seat flipped in the Senate. Okay. We have had over the last 10 years, less than, I'm trying to remember my data point, less than 10% thereabout of our elections are decided by less than 10 percentage points. So we have a general election system here that is uncompetitive, and it's uncompetitive even with a high voter turnout. What that means is that the primary elections in this state take on an incredible importance, because if you win the primary, chances are, given that the general is uncompetitive, you're going to win your seat. And what is shocking and striking is that over the last 10 years, on average, less than 22% of Tennesseans participate in the primary. So we effectively have in this state a super minority electing a majority of our representatives. And this makes total sense when you see how it flips the incentives of lawmakers on its head, because we have a supermajority in this state. Logically, if you have a supermajority of one party, you would expect to see a supermajority of the population that is thrilled to bits with the way policy is going. But it's the opposite. We have a supermajority in office, and we also have a majority of our citizenry that are disappointed and frustrated by that legislature on any number of issues. Why? Because our legislature is incentivized to work for the 22% who show up to the primary, not the 70% who show up to the general. And when you understand that the 22% who typically show up to our primaries, I don't characterize this group as extreme. I think that's the wrong way to look at it.
Okay.
It's rigid. This group is defined not by what the extremeness of what they think. They're defined by the degree to which they believe they're right. They're defined by their total and complete rigidity. This tends to be the most all-in sort of zero-sum thinkers within their parties who show up, in part because of the laws surrounding our primary process and how vague they are. It doesn't really incentivize anybody to get involved who holds a more complex view. So to me, it made total sense. I was like, oh, well, we have a legislature doing X when what the majority wants is Y on any number of issues. I mean, you can healthcare, reproductive rights, gun safety, criminal, pick your poison. The reason for that is that the incentives of lawmakers to get elected and stay elected is to please the 22% that shows up to the primary, that tends to be the most rigid thinkers within the parties, the most fringe thinkers within the parties, and ergo, why they hear the majority, but they don't fear the majority. So I thought, well, what if we just broaden and diversify the people who show up in the base and vote in the primary?
Right.
If you create more perspectives from folks from the middle and you bring them into the primary, all of a sudden, lawmakers are incentivized to please a bigger number of people. That will naturally move to the center and away from the fringe. And it's not so much about changing. I use the analogy of like you have a boss at work. It's not so much about changing the employees, it's changing the boss. And that is what inspires lawmakers. And so I think there's this notion of like lawmakers somehow based on their political affiliation have this independent set of values and ideas and perspectives. And to some degree, maybe some of them do, but really their values and perspectives are illustrated and mirrored back from the group of people that they need to please to get into office and stay there. So I just thought, well, if we can broaden and diversify the base people who show up to a primary, and then we can prove it, we can probably start to recruit better candidates to challenge those who are consistently out of step with the majority via their own party primary.
Yeah.
Let it rip.
And I know you did an experiment on this because your primary was just 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago. Before we get there, though, before you tell me about the results of that experiment, one of the things I just wanted your take on this. Sometimes when people talk about the middle, they tend to they characterize it as a almost like an ideological category. Like these are people that have views that are in between the Democrats and Republicans. But what I hear you saying is no, the middle is best understood as people that are not so rigid, that are more fluid, that are more open-minded. Am I putting words in your mouth? Is that how you think about what the middle is?
That's exactly how I think about the middle. I think about the middle in terms of complexity. And this kind of also harkens back a bit to my work as a criminal defense lawyer, that my job for 14 years was to convince juries to see a set of facts and shades of gray instead of black and white. And I recognize that when we are collectively afraid, when we feel under pressure, when we feel boxed in, we want the black and white. But that's the precise time that you shouldn't gravitate to it. You have to inject complexity. You have to account for some degree of doubt in your own thinking in order to have any kind of reasonable conversation. And so when I'm talking about the middle, I'm talking about people who, whose ideas, like extreme is such a useless way to evaluate people because one person's extremism is another's good common sense, right? But I think a better way to consider this group is a group of people that are capable of holding complex thoughts, which is the vast majority of us, right? Like we navigate the world we live in, which is incredibly nuanced and complicated. And so they've all, like, I feel like this group has sort of left the building, as it were, of politics because everyone around them, it feels as though they're so right or wrong. And I think that injection of complexity is like the critical ingredient to a more functional democracy. And then what happens from there, which policies get enacted, I don't give a hoot. Like people sometimes like, is your organization about, I really don't care where, I mean, I do personally, but like where policy goes. What this group is designed to do is create an environment where all of these policy groups can actually stand to make a difference.
Right.
But right now, it's just sort of a little bit of screaming into the void because there is no room for that complexity that's required to advance change through conversation.
Which is outrageous because as the world is more complex than it
Yes,
was. And in some ways, we need more space for complexity, not less.
absolutely.
All right. So you raised a bunch of money. You came up with an idea to increase turnout in the primaries. Tell us about this experiment that you ran. Was it a success, a failure? What happened?
Okay, so I can sadly tell everybody right now we don't have all of the granular hard numbers because our primaries just occurred on August 1st. So our Secretary of State does need to certify our elections and all of our data before we can really evaluate true success. Here's what I can tell you we did, and I can give you a little sense of what I suspect some of our preliminary analysis will show. So we launched an 8-week campaign. And what we did is we targeted segmented populations within 3 counties in Tennessee. We looked at groups of women over the age of 30 who had voted in the 2020 presidential, but not the 2020 primary, because we knew they were registered, we knew they cared, they skipped a primary. We tailored in on that audience segmentation a little bit more, and then within that audience, we ran a targeted digital campaign. So we focused on IP address mapping, and what we did is we ran banner ads, online video ads, and OTT ads. And we targeted this group based on their IP address. And so these ads that we were running focused on something really provocative and different. The whole theme baseline was the following. If you're frustrated, vote in the primary. Doesn't matter what frustrates you, doesn't matter why. If you're frustrated, vote in the primary, because so many voter turnout campaigns tend to tell you vote because it's your civic duty, vote because it matters. I was like, no, vote because if you think Rome is burning, for whatever reason you feel it's burning, and it is, you got to show up to the primary, okay? We're not going to, we're not going to beat around the bush here. We launched this campaign saying, listen, the general election in this state is largely inconsequential. I'm not saying don't vote in it. I'm not saying it doesn't matter. But we're very bold in this campaign.
Right.
And then, so we launched that. And in addition, we utilized our social media platform to build our brand and utilize longer form videos to sort of make, explanations as to why this was important. We had an earned media campaign where you just saw some of the interviews that we did.
Yep.
In Knox County, Blount County, Williamson County. We had paid media, so we ran a statewide video. We also did broadcast ad buys in the 3 evening news and the 3 nights leading up to the primary election in the evening news in Knox and Blount. So our 3 counties were Blount, Knox, and Williamson.
Okay.
And then we had some digital ads we purchased in advance. And what I can tell you briefly is that, with regard to our social media video campaign or our social media campaign, we had 2,761 interactions from about 26,000 accounts. So our engagement rate was 10.7%. Industry standard for new accounts is 1 to 3%.
Wow.
We had an 11.2% growth of our following base in 8 weeks. With one of our top videos reaching 17,700 viewers. In our digital campaign, we have over 1 million impressions between the OTT banner and our online video ads. Our paid media campaign reached usually in the ballpark of 400 to 500,000 impressions. And what we have seen is in the cumulative results reports provided by county election commissions. So each of our county election commissions will report their initial findings on number of ballots cast versus registered voters. And what we have seen based on those reports, which have not been certified here, can you tell I'm a lawyer, like giving you?
Yeah.
What we are seeing initially based on those reports without certification is that within our 3 counties, within which our targeted populations lived, each of those 3 counties was higher voter turnout than the projected statewide turnout. So the Tennessean has projected the statewide turnout to be about 14%. Again, the Secretary of State has not confirmed that, but the Tennessean initially has projected 14% based on its independent analysis. Our 3 counties were all higher than that state average. And what's interesting is that in the last 5 election cycles before this one, that's never happened. In the last 5 election cycles,
it's not like you cherry picked 3 counties that already had high turnout, right? Okay.
No, we specifically did not. So in the last 5 election cycles, Blount County was above the state average in 2016, 1 out of 5. Knox County was above the state average in 2020, 1 out of 5. And Williamson was only above the state average in 2022. So for the first time in 10 years, we see all 3 counties that contained our audience population coming in above the projected state average. Now, how much above? I'm going to wait until we get those official reports. And if some huge seismic shift changes, please know that's based all on initial findings.
Well, it's so important because you're not going to change the culture overnight. And the culture that we live in every state in this country is regular people vote in the general election, only the hardcore vote in the primaries. That's the culture. And going up against that is going to take a lot of sustained education and engagement with the 80% that don't see the primaries as their elections. And
well, yeah, and like I should also mention, we also have a political arm of this organization.
Right.
So our primary, base entity is a 501c4. We have a super PAC and a PAC. Our super PAC ran independent expenditures to support 4 candidates in their state legislative primaries. All 4 primaries were competitive. We supported 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. Every candidate supported matched our model, meaning every candidate that we supported was a more practical, complex thinker than the person they were challenging or the person challenging them, which was a more rigid, fringe thinker. All 4 of our candidates were successful. One of those candidates was successful by less than 300 votes.
Wow.
And so this is also one of the elements to this project is to hopefully take the data that will hopefully show that we can mobilize a middle majority and take what we learn to scale this project and figure out based on market research what to say, where to say it, and how to say it, with regard to continuing to build this base in advance of the 26 cycle. Our political team will then take this data and begin to evaluate in 2025 districts in Tennessee where we believe that more thoughtful, complex, pragmatic leaders would do far better than incumbents who are expressing a more fringe view. And we're going to go and help community members recruit candidates. And how better to recruit them than to say, most people in Tennessee would tell you, I'd love to run for office, but I can't win a primary because I'm not fringe enough. We are hoping that we will be able to use this data via our political team to help recruit candidates to challenge more fringe incumbents within their party primary. And by virtue of working exclusively within the primary system, we step away during the general. We let the general election do what it's going to do because there's millions of groups already involved. So it kind of creates this. Our right hand and our left hand are working simultaneously. We're building out a base of middle majority voters who represent more complex thinking while simultaneously showing potential candidates that we can build a base of middle majority voters to help recruit great folks to run within their party primary system.
That's really smart. We're going to open it up for questions in 2 minutes. Again, if you want to ask a question, put your name, your state, and a 1-sentence description of what you want to ask in the chat, and then we'll get you in the queue and I'll turn to you. But before we do that, Chloe, so Tennessee's an open primary state. You don't have partisan registration, but there's been 2 efforts to try to restrict voting in the primaries. One is this, which you've written about, this sign that gets hung in every polling place that says you have to be a bona fide party member to vote in the primaries, even though that's not defined. Another example of just terribly written law. And the other is there's been bills introduced to force people to join a party and enact closed party registration. Is that part of like the rules of the primary? Is that an aspect of what you and your team are engaging?
Yes. So, when we first talked, when John and I first spoke, one of the challenging elements of Tennessee is that we are technically an open primary, but not entirely. And this is where my legal my job before this was to nitpick. And so it persists. So technically what our laws say is not that you can vote in the primary for any party you feel like at any given time. That's not what it says. What the law says is you are allowed to vote in the primary for the party that you are either a bona fide member of or affiliated with at the time that you go to vote. Now, fun fact, the law does not define what does it mean to be a bona fide member.
Right.
What does it mean to be? So it creates this confusion where you tell people that you have to vote in the primary for the party that you are affiliated with or you have allegiance to, I believe is the exact term, bona fide member of or have declared allegiance to at the time. But like, what does that even mean? And so one of the things that we're attempting to do that's really hard is explain that, right? To the extent that that has acted as a barrier and may act as a barrier to getting people involved in the primary, you have to figure out a way to break that down and just explain it to people. And that was, why I wrote the op-ed that I wrote. And I think there was this intimidation based on ambiguity.
Yep.
And I really think it's incumbent upon our organization to help alleviate some of that to the extent that we can. And so the other elements to my work, and I guess this brings it all the way back around to the Instagram video. I have a knack, I guess, for explaining complicated things in ways that make sense. And I think this comes back to being a trial lawyer because I had to explain like complex factual scenarios and legal concepts. And I think that if you can speak plainly and just explain to folks and like demystify part of the primary process, that is also really an important building block to creating more engagement from that middle majority. And so, yes, it's certainly something that we have to navigate and deal with. And it'll be interesting to see, what, if any, efforts in the 25 or the 26 legislative session involve closing primaries. And there was certainly people were, caught between a rock and a hard place. Like, don't talk about the primary law because then they may close it. Well, if we don't talk about the primary laws, nobody's going to vote in them anyway. So is closing them, how much worse is it going to get? Voter turnout's 15%, is closing the primaries and alleviating the ambiguity, could that actually have a reverse effect? I honestly, I don't know. I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah. And also, there's efforts all over the country to leave the party primary system in the dust and just go to a public primary where there's just a single ballot and all the candidates are on it. And hopefully if you're able to increase turnout in the existing system and prevent it from being closed as more and more of the country goes to a non-party based system, maybe that could be on the agenda in Tennessee.
You would love that.
Oh, and I did, by the way, I did a podcast recently in Tennessee where you talk about intimidation through ambiguity. The way I put it was, they found a way to give voters a beating without leaving any marks.
Yeah, I mean, it's also very interesting to me that again, kind of coming full circle, one of the issues that I spotted very fast with Tennessee's law on abortion is that there is significant ambiguity in the definitions of what it means to prevent death, which is considered an exception. But if you don't know how close to death a patient has to be, and you're not given any quantifiable metric to evaluate that, and you're forced to weigh your personal liberty interest against a standard of care in a context that is ambiguous, the natural result of that is you're not going to want to do the thing. Like, that's how laws work. We want to keep you from doing something. And so when you have ambiguity in the law where the ambiguity is directly related to the thing that makes an act criminal or not criminal, people generally err on the side of not doing the thing.
Right.
That logic applies whether it's voting, whether it's pregnancy termination. You could put it in any category, but when it is voting or it's terminating a pregnancy in a complicated medical emergency, all of the sudden that manifests, and the effects of that can really spin out in ways that I don't think are quite contemplated fully when legislation is passed.
Yeah. No, that's very well put. All right. We're going to start things off with someone in Tennessee. I just think that's appropriate. Stephen Culp has a question about the legislature, and then we got a bunch of questions from around the country. So let's start with you, Stephen. Go ahead.
Okay, so the question I posted is essentially, how likely do you think it is that the Tennessee legislature outruns our efforts and their own efforts to secure the status quo? The examples I threw in there were, several years ago, they preemptively outlawed ranked choice voting when nobody even knew what that was. Then obviously the efforts you're describing to affect open primaries with this, as I described it in my own op-ed, sort of Dukes of Hazzard boss hog style bona fide law. How do we make progress when that legislative supermajority is so organized, motivated, and empowered to make laws that suit them?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, listen, it's a great question. Can we outrun it? That's a good way of putting it. I don't know. I really don't. I mean, we've seen the legislature on a number of issues pass legislation that is intended to preempt possible changes that could come based on shifts in composition. And we've seen it in policy areas outside of obviously just this voting, the sign law. And I think it is important also to note that the law mandating that you be a bona fide member has been on the books since 1972. The change that came was an amendment to the law, which required a sign to be posted in polling places that alerted people to the law. And that's a subtle distinction. I mean, look, the answer is, I don't know. I hope so. And one of the most liberating parts about working, I think, in this environment right now is it can't get much worse. And so I think any effort to engage and talk about these issues in a way that is not divisive, that keeps the conversation going instead of shutting it down, is well served, because it creates a scenario where more people are paying attention. I also think that the silver lining of the Tennessee legislature's just general kind of going off the rails in the last year or so is that they've managed to shockingly offend just about everybody in Tennessee.
Wow. Wow.
Just about everybody, for totally different reasons. Okay, this is important to know. What offends one person or affects one person is different for another. But they have managed to, in essence, re-engage almost everybody in Tennessee in the state legislative process. If you are a teacher, a police officer, a lawyer, a parent, a judge, a nurse, a doctor, a husband, a wife, a single person, quite literally, if you live here, there is likely something that has happened in the last 2 years at the state legislative level that deeply impacts your life or the life of someone very close to you. That is a moment that needs to be harnessed. And I think that knowing that we have that ability to, knowing that we already have the one eye of the majority of Tennesseans on us, I think it's incumbent upon people in this organization, like in this space, to keep the focus, and hopefully that will mitigate the attempts to get out in front of changes that people think could be coming based on shifting compositions.
Got it. Hey, Scott, did you want to jump in here?
Well, I did. So I'll introduce myself. I'm the lobbyist for the Sierra Club in Tennessee.
Okay.
And we do engage very directly in rural red districts in the primaries, and we encourage our voters to go out in August and vote in the Republican primaries so that we end up with more moderate Republicans that are, I think, as Chloe said, deeper thinking about things. And then when it comes to the current legislature, I mean, we did not see the bills go through that attempted to close our primaries because moderate Republicans do not want to be primaried by far right wing people. Unfortunately, we did lose a couple of, I think, deeper thinking legislators during these last primaries, where they mainly got targeted over gun laws and using public money to give vouchers to parents to send their kids to private schools,
Mm-hmm.
to the detriment of our public schools. But I'm going to say that the current, the current supermajority in Tennessee is probably a majority of them are going to say no to closing primaries because they do recognize that that helps defend them from, primary attempts from the further right.
Yeah, let's hope so. All right, we're going to go to Nancy Hanks in Pennsylvania, who has a question about candidate recruitment. Go ahead, Nancy. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, John. Yeah, I've been active with the Forward Party here in Philadelphia in particular, and statewide throughout Pennsylvania, which is it's the keystone state, but it's also a hotbed, of independent activism. I wanted to ask you, Chloe, what's your read on reaching out to independents as opposed to trying to bring together, the Democrats and Republicans into a quote centrist moderate? I have a long time aversion to doing something that is considered moderate, having grown up in the South and partly in Tennessee, where moderate means, yeah, let's bring them along. So what do you think about that?
Sure. That's a great question. So first of all, you will never hear me use the word moderate. I'm only using it, Nancy, because you said it first. And I say that because we have a jar of, you put $1 in when you say it, because it's really like, for our purposes, I think moderate has a connotation that is negative. And we're not talking about candidates that are moderate in terms of policy, because that's just another way to frame things in terms of extremism, which again is really irrelevant. I think that when we're talking about candidate recruitment, what we're looking for are great leaders who can communicate, who can collaborate, who have character and courage not to not only say what they think, but admit when they're wrong. And these are not things that lend themselves to a score sheet. They're not objective, but simply because they're not objective doesn't mean they're unimportant. And in fact, I think these characteristics have typically grown less and less important because they don't lend themselves to a clear scorecard. And so when we begin the process of candidate recruitment in 2025, I think working with our political team and our political director, part of what we're looking for is districts that lend themselves to this type of shift, right? That for in quantifiable, and sort of objective and subjective analysis, lend themselves to a better candidate. And then working, like a huge difference in our organization and some others is that we want to work directly with community members to help build a great candidate profile, like Chamber of Commerce, teachers, faith-based leaders, small business. Go into these communities and say, what would a great candidate look like to you? Let's first decide what that candidate looks like. Then let's try to go find somebody who fits that category and empower.
Well, can I ask you, so do you reach out to the ordinary people?
Oh yeah.
What's that look like for you?
Well, we haven't done it yet, so I don't know exactly. One of our big strategies one of our next steps is to sit down and have 2 separate strategy sessions in the fall to begin to evaluate how specifically to go in and communicate with community members. I think that changes based on which communities you go in, because Tennessee is 3 states: East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee, and West Tennessee, and communicating with communities within each of those subsets is really different per community. I also think that you asked a very interesting question about independence. So Alaska ran a fascinating strategy a few years ago, where a kind of wild, renegade, awesome group of political strategists ran a whole bunch of independents. And they shifted the composition of their entire state legislature based on running independents against Republicans and Democrats rather than within the party primary process. Now, this worked for Alaska because the notion of independence is kind of baked into their DNA in a different way than it is in Tennessee. But I think that there may be districts that we want to help recruit candidates in where we look for a really solid independent. And that might be the only situation in which we ever get involved in a general election, is the extent to which an independent runs against a Democrat or a Republican in the general, and only against a Democrat or a Republican, because obviously triangulating the vote doesn't work. I also think it kind of bears some repeating that this strategy isn't limited to the Republican Party. Like, every action has a reaction. And I have heard so many times in Tennessee, you can't both sides extremism. Okay, you can absolutely both sides rigidity.
Yep.
Both sides of our political process in Tennessee are convinced to a moral certainty that they are right. And the other side is an existential threat to our way of life. And they are both guilty of that. And they are both perpetuating that rigidity. And so to suggest that this problem is the result of some Republican supermajority, I think is a vast oversimplification. I think that we need to empower more of that middle majority complexity and, diverse way of thinking to both parties, because I'm watching them both move as far to the fringe as they can get. And then when anybody from the party tiptoes towards the center, they get primaried. And I think it's important to understand getting primaried isn't something that just happens to Republican lawmakers. It's
Right.
going to start happening to Democratic lawmakers as well. And it cannot happen if we want to move this way instead of that way.
All right. I want to go to Lou Hinman in New York, who has a question about the videos that you made, Chloe. Go ahead,
Great.
Lou. Oh, you're on mute. There you go.
Yes. Chloe, thank you for what you've been telling us. I would like to. I'd like to know how we follow you. I have to confess to being a senior citizen who is somewhat Instagram illiterate. So, but I would like to know how to the videos you mentioned. I would love to see. And I'd like to follow you in what you're doing. It sounds terribly exciting. Your conversation was so full of interesting things. So just tell me how to do that.
Okay, I'm gonna do you one better than tell you. I'm just gonna put the link to our Instagram profile in the chat, and that way everybody can follow.
Okay.
And
great.
Lou, we're going to
Thank you.
send up a follow-up to this virtual discussion that includes a recording of this, plus links to Best of Tennessee, recent op-eds that Chloe's done, YouTube videos they put out, and so forth. So you'll get a complete follow-up.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
right.
Thank you.
Elizabeth Hawks in Kentucky has a question about, well, I'll let you ask it. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I think you've kind of covered it already earlier. So I was just curious how that new law and all the attention paid, if all of the attention paid to it because of that may have increased the turnout. And I think your consensus was, we don't know yet.
We don't know yet. I could tell you that the projected statewide turnout this election cycle is a little over 14%. It's the first time in 30 years that, or maybe the second or third time in 30 years that it's ever gone below 14%. So clearly that discussion of the law wasn't increasing turnout. It's really hard to pin down exactly, obviously, what causes turnout to increase or decrease in a given year. And everybody tries. And I understand that there's data analytics involved. But 2022 was a midterm year, but it also happened to be a gubernatorial primary and an open gubernatorial with an incumbent governor. And that was 19%. Our 2020 primaries were 24%, 2018, another midterm year, 30%. But that year was an open gubernatorial. So it's hard to say. I think that by talking about the law, it was getting talked about anyway. So I felt like we needed to address it kind of head on. And yeah, I guess it could have gone one way or the other.
All right, I want to go to Kirk Anderson, who has a question about the tools you have at your disposal to make change. Go ahead, Kirk.
Yeah, we have initiative process in Arizona, and I've helped collect signatures on it. We've got 580,000 signatures for open primaries, as you know, John.
Yep.
And I was wondering if you had something like that could help you come up with a solution that would fit the process. So
no, we do not. Kirk, we do not have a citizen initiated ballot referendum procedure in this state. So this is where I hit what you might call a rock bottom when I was trying to understand how to bring the abortion law more in line with the majority view. Because we have a state constitutional amendment that specifically does not recognize abortion as a part of our right to privacy, which our state Supreme Court had previously upheld. We then lost the constitutional hook at the federal level. We do not have a citizen-initiated ballot referendum process. So when I was talking to people who had an interest in repairing the law to be more reflective of a majority view, I often told them the truth. The only way out is through. The only way to repair a law limiting access to reproductive care is to go through the legislature, because we don't have a citizen-initiated referendum. I suspect that if we did have a referendum on access to abortion, it would probably play just as every other state in the country has, to a direct vote. But we don't, and so and that impacts primary voting, that impacts reproductive rights, that impacts guns, and we have no citizen-initiated ballot referendum. So Tennessee really is, and I joke about this sometimes, like, if we can do any of this stuff here, you can do it anywhere in the country.
Right.
It's true.
We are 51st in voter turnout from the 2022 midterms, 51st counting the District of Columbia. We have no citizen-initiated ballot referendum process. We have a ideological supermajority. We have incredible polarization and division between our parties. We have literally everything that could go wrong here has gone wrong. And so why on earth I decided this would be the time and the place to do all of this, I don't know. But I do think that if we can repair systemically some of what is going on in Tennessee, you can truly do this in any other state in the country, which is why I think it is actually worth our time to figure out the ways to repair in the worst circumstances and in the most hostile environment, because then it only gets easier.
Okay. I understand. Thanks.
I find that very motivating, Chloe, because you're right. A lot of states look like Tennessee. A question for you. So you're raising money, and you've been successful at this, to increase participation in the primary process, but you're not, and yes, you have a PAC to support specific candidates, but your turnout project is not based on to participate in the primary to vote for X or vote for Y.
Correct.
It's not outcome oriented. It's, in some ways, you're saying adding complexity to the voter pool is the outcome, not who gets elected. So how do donors relate to that? Because a lot of donors want to give money to get X elected or to get this issue forward. What are those conversations like?
Well, they are kind of like this. So the first, we're going to have data that we can utilize to illustrate this point, hopefully in the fall. But leading up until this point, I think that the conversations with donors, I know because I was having all of them, we really talked about and framed this project as a startup. This is innovation at its core. And I think this is also explaining to people, we are creating a new way to advance a solution to a very old problem. And it requires a way of thinking that is creative and ambitious and new. And you can't have creativity and ambition and innovation without failure. So we always managed expectations, I think, and I hope, and we try to consistently say, what we were working on building over the first 18 months was a concept. It took a team of really smart people a year and a half to even get to the place where we could create a strategy and execute it to broaden and diversify a primary voting base, right? Like we had to work back, and every time we would build something up and we'd think we had it, it get torn it down again, right? Which is the process of creating something. And so I think when we talk to our donors, one of the, like probably the number one thing that I took away from almost every conversation with a donor was that they were just ready to try something new.
Okay.
They were just so tired of feeling like they were giving to candidates who were consistently not getting elected in the general because it wasn't competitive. They were voting in the general and not having any accountability in the legislature in the session. They were aware that something was missing, but they couldn't put their finger on it. And there was such an exhaustion that I think coming to donors with an opportunity to invest in something that is different, that is creative, that is new, that no one has tried, has been what has been successful about this. But it's also, I mean, like, it is innovative. It may not work right out of the gate. And I learned, and I have learned over the last year or so, that politics is in my opinion, an industry in this country that could most benefit from innovation. Yet it remains an industry in this country that never sees it. Why? Because it has no capacity for failure. Because every time my project evolved, and it evolved from the Liminal Plan when it was just about abortion, then we started talking about 3 bigger issues. Then I realized that it wasn't about amplifying issues at all. It was about accountability. So we had to move it. Then every time we evolved the project, after we received more information, I mean, people like melted down. They were like, this is a failure. What is happening? We don't, and it was such an interesting reflection of like the capacity to manage change in the political industry is zero. And if you can't embrace some degree of failure, you will never have innovation. Like the two things don't work without one on the other. And so I think when I talk to people about their own ideas and their own projects, and when I talk to donors and I talk to people on calls like this, like, I don't know that this entire strategy I just laid out for all 100 of y'all is going to work. What I can tell you is that, to my knowledge, no one has ever tried it in Tennessee. And they certainly haven't done it like this. And it is incumbent upon us to try something new. And it's not pleasant sometimes, because I feel this vice grip around me within politics of like, but we don't do it that way. And I'm like, well, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad tidings, but the way y'all have been doing it is not working. So I think that there's like this powerful element of innovation and creativity that donors are really excited about. I hope that they get even more excited about it, because we need to fund this project through 2026. And I think 2026 is going to be, that's the big boy. That's the year where we can really start to see whether or not this strategy and this idea is functional, but we need capital to get us there.
Well, thank you, Chloe. And this is, I'm just speaking for myself. I feel very nourished and inspired by your work. You know, something we in the open primaries movement talk a lot about is how opening the primaries is not a silver bullet. What it does is create a little bit of oxygen for creativity, for innovation. Doesn't guarantee it. Doesn't mean it's going to happen. But your experience of the vice grip, we experience every day, and it's really holding the country back. And anything we can do to amplify, to support. Frankly, I love that journalist saying, let's go national. I'd love to see Best of Tennessee have 50 state organizations, and anything we can do to help, we will do. We're out of time. We have some great discussions planned for this fall. This is a big year. As everyone here knows, we've got referendums on the ballot all over the country. We've got litigation, we've got legislation, we've got conversations and initiatives. So stay tuned in the next 90 days for some really interesting conversations that are coming down the pike. Thank you again, Chloe. Thank all of you. You'll be getting a follow-up email in the next day or two, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great rest of the summer.
Thank you all so much.